Okay, so in this video we're going to briefly examine what the laws of a king are, the mitzvot and the isurim, and after doing that we're going to take a look at the deeper question of whether it's a mitzvah to have a king at all. So the key passage here in the Torah is in Devarim Perek Yud Zayin. It's sometimes called Parashat HaMelech, and over here the Torah says that when you enter the land that Hashem gives you, meaning Eretz Canaan, and you say, Asima alai melech k'chol hagoyim asher svivotai, let me appoint a king, just like all the other nations. The Torah says, Som tasim alecha melech, appoint a king. We're going to discuss whether that's a mitzvah later, but appoint a king, or you can appoint a king that Hashem chooses. And the Torah warns right away that this king may not be a foreigner, a Gentile. Lo tuchal ater alecha ish nochri asher lo achichahu. The king cannot be an ish nochri. Rather, he must be mikerav achacha, from your brethren, meaning a fellow Jew. Now, that's not so hard to understand. There could be concerns about loyalty of a foreigner, just like in America, the law is that you have to be a U.S. citizen from birth in order to be president. There might also be concerns here about culture and religion, that Ish Nochri is likely to be a pagan, is likely to be an idol worshiper. He's going to bring a different culture and a different value system that would include Avodah Zarah into Israel. So that's sort of basically that you can have this king, but he cannot be an Ish Nochri. And once you have your Jewish king, the Torah gives three famous prohibitions. Three things the king is not allowed to do. Number one, Rak lo yarbeh lo susim, he's not allowed to have too many horses. Number two, I'm skipping here to the next pasuk, Lo yarbeh lo nashim, he cannot have too many wives. The Navi does not say, and Chumash do not say how many that is, but the Gemara says the limit is 18. Starting with the 19th wife, the king violates this Isser. V'chesef v'zahav lo yarbeh lo ma'od, and he cannot have too much gold and silver. So those are the three no-nos, the three things that are asur lamelech. Excessive amounts of horses, wives, and gold and silver, money. In addition, the king has a positive commandment. What I mean by chukim lamelech over here, he has to write a Sefer Torah. Here it's referred to as Mishnah Torah Azot al Sefer. He has to write a Sefer Torah, and he has to keep that Torah with him. He has to carry it with him and read it. And the hope is that keeping that Torah with him will remind him that he's still subservient to the Torah, even though he feels like he's the most powerful man in the country, and he is the most powerful man in the country, but he's still not more powerful than God. He still has to be humble before God and the Torah. And we further noted when we studied this that these Isurim and this mitzvah of the Torah, these things, some of them are just stated, like it just says you can't have too much money. It seems like we understand intuitively why it would be bad for a king to have too much money, whereas certain of the Isurim the Torah explains. So in terms of not having too many horses, the Torah points out that Egypt at the time was a center of horse trading, by which I mean literal horse trading horses. And so there's a concern, you might take Jews back to Egypt, and that's the place Hashem told us not to go back to. Hashem removed us from there. We might go back there to get horses. And you're allowed to temporarily visit Egypt. I think the concern here is that if we need a constant supply of horses, we're going to be constantly dependent upon them. Similarly, lo yarbeh lo nashim, not having too many wives, the Torah explains lo yasru levavo. If he has too many wives, they're going to turn his heart astray. Now, that's actually not clear. We discussed in class, there are two interpretations of what this means. One is that he'll be a king kind of like Achashverosh, if you know Achashverosh in the Purim story, where he's so obsessed with all his women in his harem, so obsessed in indulging in his own pleasures with these women, that it distracts him from doing the real jobs of a king, of governing the country, running a country. So that could be one concern. If the king has too many wives, he'll focus on his own pleasure and not pay attention to governing the country. There is a second concern, which is not made clear here, but it becomes clear when you study what happens to Shlomo, where a lot of the wives a king would be tempted to take are going to be non-Jewish wives, since often a king would marry foreign princesses as a way of solidifying alliances with those countries. So Shlomo, for example, marries Paro's daughter, and that solidifies his relationship with Egypt. And so there may be a concern that if you marry a lot of foreign wives, we're concerned they shouldn't lead its heart astray. In other words, if you marry all these women who come from other countries where they worship other gods, they're going to bring that avodah zarah into your country. And that does happen to Shlomo, that some of his foreign wives, once they're living in Jerusalem, they now want him to build mizbechot for them to serve their gods. Later in the year, we're going to talk a little bit about Achav, who lived much later, where a similar thing happens. Achav marries a princess from a place called Sidon, which is in Lebanon today, and they worship an avodah zarah named Baal there. And while he's king, Baal worship takes hold in Israel. So there's a connection there. The fact that he married this princess from a country where they worship Baal means she's now the queen of Israel, and she brings her idol worship with her, and therefore spreads it to Israel. And so again, there are two concerns. One, that too many wives, even if they're Jewish wives, may just distract him from his job of governing. But number two, particularly with foreign wives, there's this concern that his heart will be turned away from Hashem, and he'll be drawn to avodah zarah. In addition to the mitzvah of writing a Torah, the Torah says about that by having it with him, he's going to remember to fear Hashem, to keep the words of the Torah, and also it's going to humble him. Hopefully he also won't raise his heart up over his brothers, meaning the rest of the Jews. Right? There's this concern that a king who's so powerful will feel he's so much greater than everyone else. Carrying a Torah with him is a way of reminding him, you're not so great. You keep the same Torah everybody else keeps. And so hopefully he also won't exploit his power unfairly against other people, because he'll remember he's not so much greater than them. They're all humans who answer to Hashem. Now, based on all this, is it a mitzvah to appoint a king? So it says over here, Som tasim alech hamelech. That could be translated different ways. That could be translated as, you shall surely appoint the king, which would be like a mitzvah, like you better do that, you have to do that. It could also be interpreted as, you may appoint the king. If you want one, if you say, Asima alai melech, then you're allowed to have one. And so we find a debate among the Meforshim regarding how to interpret this. Rambam says very clearly it's a mitzvah. In his count, it's mitzvah number 183. We were commanded to appoint the king. The king will unite our whole nation. That seems to be the main positive thing that a king can do. If you think of some of the other sources that we studied, described how there had been a lot of chaos and anarchy under the Shoftim, and Shaul and later David unite everyone under them. So for that reason, says the Rambam, the Torah wants us to have a king. So it commanded us, nitztavinu, we were commanded, like the word mitzvah, to have a king. And says the Rambam, that's what it means, Som tasim alech hamelech. So the Rambam interprets this phrase, Som tasim alech hamelech, as an absolute command. You must put a king above you. Now the obvious problem with the Rambam's view is, if having a king is so great, then how come everything after this pasuk within the Parshat HaMelech in the Torah is all about restricting what a king can do? If a king is so great, then how come the main thing the Torah tells us about him is to make sure his power doesn't get out of control? Don't let him have too much this, don't let him have too much that. Make sure he carries the Torah with him to keep him in line. So I think Rambam would answer, like he said, the king serves a positive role. To unite the country under one leader, to be one strong nation. There are also downsides, right? There are pluses and minuses to a king. The Torah wants us to have a king because of the plus sides. Then the Torah adds restrictions, various isurim, to keep the downsides in check. And so the Torah's ideal is a king with some limited powers. A king who can't be too powerful. Ibn Ezra, who was actually slightly older than the Rambam, Ibn Ezra passed away when Rambam was pretty young. He was one generation older than him. Ibn Ezra looks at the same word Som Tasim, and he says, Reshut, it's optional. In other words, the Torah is not saying you must appoint a king. The Torah is saying, if you want, you may appoint a king. Right? In the pasuk before, the Torah said that people may say, Asima alai melech, let me appoint a king. If you want that, then the Torah says, fine, if you want to, you're allowed to do so. Abarbanel basically agrees with Ibn Ezra, but he presents it in a much more negative tone. See, Ibn Ezra, in that one word, Reshut, it sounds like Ibn Ezra is kind of like neutral about it. Like, if you want one, that's okay. If you don't want one, that's also okay. Abarbanel agrees it's not a mitzvah, but he says not only is it only optional and not a mitzvah, really the Torah thinks it's a bad idea. The Torah is only allowing it because it's concerned that we're going to insist upon it. But when the Torah says it's allowed, what it really means is you're better off without one, but if you insist, I'll let you have one, as long as he obeys certain rules. So the Barbanel says, Ein b'zeh mitzvah klal. It's not a mitzvah at all. Why not? Ki lo tzivah Hashem parach she'amru zeh v'shalom melech. The Torah didn't command them to say this, to say we want a king. Right? If we look back in our psukim over here in Devarim Yud Zayin, it had said, V'amarta sima alei melech. You're going to say, let me appoint a king like all the other nations. So the Torah commanded you to do that. The Torah doesn't mean that as a mitzvah that you must want a king like the Gentile nations. Rather, the Torah is predicting the future. I know it's going to happen that you're going to look around and see everyone else has a king and you're going to want to be just like them. So Barbanel says the next pasuk, Som tasim alecha melech, is continuing with that same situation. It's predicting you're going to say you want a king, and if so, if that's what you say, then you can appoint one as long as you appoint one asher yivchar Hashem elokecha bo, as long as you appoint one that Hashem chooses, as opposed to any old king, k'chol hagoyim asher svivotai. So according to the Barbanel, the Torah is saying you can do that, but it's not a mitzvah at all. It's just hagadat ha'atid, predicting the future. Not only that, but Barbanel thinks the Torah considers it a really bad idea. Even though it's letting you do it, it's letting you do it. It's letting you do it because it knows you're going to be unappreciative. Meaning, according to Barbanel, if you appreciated what Hashem had done for you when you didn't have a king, to bring you into the land under the leadership of Moshe, and then Yehoshua, and then the Shoftim, and the Nevi'im, if you appreciated that, you wouldn't even want a king. Hashem is saying, I know you're going to be a jerk, you're going to be unappreciative, and therefore when you say, when you say on your own, give us a king, in that case, I'll let you have one according to these rules. Right? And so having a king, what is it? Sometimes we call it a mitzvah to appoint a king, but Barbanel says it's not really a mitzvah. Rather, it's like a mitzvah tluya b'dvar reshut. It's a mitzvah that depends on something optional, even something inappropriate. The example he compares it to, which is a very strong example, he says that we say there's a mitzvah to do tshuva, but does that mean you should go out of your way to eat a cheeseburger just so you can do tshuva? Obviously not. Better yet would be if you never ate the cheeseburger in the first place. So just like somebody who sins has a mitzvah to do tshuva, but the better thing to do would be to not sin in the first place, so too, says the Barbanel, if you want a king, there's a mitzvah to only appoint the type of king that Hashem chooses, and several other mitzvot that the king has to follow. But better yet would be if nothing in this parsha applied to you at all, because you would never appoint a king in the first place. We added something interesting here about the Barbanel, that Barbanel worked in the cabinet of Ferdinand and Isabella, Queen in Spain in the 1400s, and in 1492, when all the Jews were expelled from Spain and the Inquisition began, Barbanel was given the opportunity to stay because he worked on the financial part of government under the King and Queen of Spain, and they hated Jews, but they weren't stupid. They still cared about their money, and so they were the really smart Jew who was managing their money was going to be allowed to stay. Barbanel chose on his own to leave. He went to Portugal and later to Italy. And it was a very traumatic experience. I mean, Spanish Jewry had been this amazing community for centuries that was just eradicated by them. And if you look at Barbanel's writings, in some of his earlier writings, he's much more positive about the respect that we have to have for Gentile kings, Gentile authorities whom we live under. And in his later writings, he turns very hostile towards the whole idea of government and especially monarchy. And he felt like he was qualified to speak about this because he saw from up close what it was like to live under a monarch and under a government that abused the Jewish community, that stabbed them in the back, and that persecuted them. And so Barbanel, when he says these very harsh words here, that it's best not to have a king, and that all the mitzvot associated with a king are just like the mitzvot of tshuva, where it's only if you sin that you have to do tshuva, so it's only if you do a bad thing by having a king that then you have to keep these other mitzvot to restrict the king's negative behaviors. Barbanel felt like he knew from experience why the Torah would want to very much restrict a king, or better yet, not command you to have a king at all. So again, Rambam thinks it's a mitzvah, Ibn Ezra thinks it's optional, and Abarbanel also thinks it's optional, but it's really preferable to not have a king at all. Maybe in a separate video we'll talk about the Netziv.